France is the most visited country in the world. Every year, about 100 million people travel to the country, and over half of them arrive by road. And while many appreciate the scenic routes, France's highways are busy. Especially this one. The A6-A7 highways to Marseille are also some of Europe's most expensive. For the 770-kilometer drive from Paris to Marseille, the toll fees amount to about 70 euros. But if you drive the same distance elsewhere, say from Brussels to Berlin, you pay nothing. So why do some countries charge to use their fastest roads, while others make it free? Funding the building and maintenance of highway infrastructure differs across countries. In some places, motorists help pay for it through a bridge and/or a tunnel toll. In others, road tolls are thrown into the mix as well. Some countries charge drivers for a vignette, a sticker placed on the car that gives them access to the highways. And in a handful of countries, there are no tolls, with funding being drawn from local or national taxes. In most cases, the money generated from tolls goes to the state. But in France, most highways are under concession, meaning private companies secure a license to operate them for a fixed period. France's concession roads are run by 19 companies, but 91% of the network is managed by just 3, Abertis, Eiffage and Vinci.
Non, pas normal, non.
Ce sont des sociétés privées qui s'en prennent un maximum. Ils devraient tous pouvoir bénéficier d'autoroutes moins chères.
C'est une évidence, les Français estiment qu'ils payent trop pour le tarif des autoroutes. Le système concessif est basé sur la prise de risque. Et il y a un grand débat en France, puisqu'on estime que finalement ce risque est assez limité.
Just going to England and back cost us 180 euros on the tolls.
So how did France's highways become so expensive? And is the system working for its users? Watch the news in France and you'll notice that highways are talked about a lot. Packed during the holiday season, motorways are often seen as a symbol of freedom and protest. And yet, at the end of World War II, most of the roads in France were still national roads, known as routes nationales. There was only one short 20-kilometer highway near Paris.
L'État français a été très performant en termes de construction des routes pour des raisons historiques.
This is Jean-François Calmette. He's an author and lecturer in public law at the University of Perpignan.
Pour les autoroutes, la France a eu quelques retards par rapport à d'autres pays, puisque bizarrement, ce sont avant tout des pays très autoritaires, du type l'Allemagne nazie et l'Italie mussolinienne, qui ont construit les premières autoroutes, notamment pour des raisons stratégiques liées à la guerre, puisque les autoroutes initialement également servaient aux troupes de ces deux pays, mais également pour des raisons qui magnifiaient un petit peu la figure tutélaire du chef.
As France began to rebuild its economy after the war, it also started to construct what would become today's most popular motorways.
L'État a décidé de construire ces autoroutes, là encore pour des raisons de maillage territorial et pour des raisons liées à l'aménagement du territoire et à une forme de décentralisation. Et à l'instar du réseau ferroviaire qui était mis en place sous forme d'étoiles au début, eh bien avec la décentralisation, on a mis en place le maillage territorial plutôt sous forme de toile d'araignée.
France's current high-speed road network was rolled out in 3 major steps. First, confronted with the financial toll of the war, the French state opened its system to a concession model to build the highways.
Une concession, en fait, c'est un mode de gestion, la plupart du temps, d'une infrastructure ou d'une ressource rare. Par exemple l'eau, mais également les autoroutes.
A level of toll is being stipulated, which effectively says how much a car or different types of vehicles will pay to use the motorway, and that is set for the duration of the concession and may be indexed annually because the concession will typically be quite long. And that is basically the main economic parameter of the concession.
So in France, you can take the toll roads that are much faster. In our case, I think it saves us 2.5 hours. Or you have the secondary road, which are free to use, but there's more speed restrictions.
The concession model enables the state to transfer debt for building infrastructure over to concession companies, which can take on more debt and therefore build a much wider network. The private highways have also proven to be safer, up to 10 times less dangerous than other roads.
Dans le cadre d'une concession, eh bien, il y a un contrat entre le concédant, qui est l'État, qui va déléguer donc la gestion d'un service public à un concessionnaire et donc à une entreprise privée.
Perhaps the greatest force for change on the Riviera is the new motorway. It's a toll road. We paid about 3 6 for the 15 miles so far completed.
From the 1950s onwards, the French government began using these concession companies to finance and build its highway networks. The contracts were typically written up for 35-year terms, with the intention of the companies returning the highways to the state free of charge once built.
Ces sociétés étaient quand même sous contrôle étatique très fort. On avait également déjà des problèmes budgétaires. On a fait appel plutôt à des opérateurs privés pour investir dans le cadre de ces réseaux, même si, attention, l'essentiel du réseau initial avait quand même été construit par l'intermédiaire de ces sociétés d'économie mixte.
The second major step in the construction of highways came alongside a rapid rise in French public debt, used to finance public spending in areas such as education and health in the 1970s onwards. Between 1980 and 1997, public debt multiplied 8 times, going from 589 billion francs to more than 4.5 trillion francs. And so, the state opened its national companies to more private equity, including from concession companies. In the 1980s and 1990s, successive French governments sold many of the country's main banks, such as BNP in 1993 and Crédit Lyonnais in 1999. It also sold some of its state-owned transport manufacturers and airline Air France, as well as energy companies like Total in 1995 and Gaz de France in 2005. This led to the third step, the full privatization of highway management.
En 2005, il y a eu un rapport qui était le premier rapport un petit peu alarmiste s'agissant de la dette de l'État. Et quelques mois après, les services de Bercy et ensuite l'ancien Premier ministre Dominique de Villepin avaient décidé donc cette privatisation de la gestion des autoroutes. Il ne s'agit pas d'une privatisation de l'infrastructure en elle-même, puisqu'il n'y a pas de transfert total de propriété publique vers le privé. Les autoroutes font partie du domaine public routier et ce que l'on a privatisé, c'est la gestion des autoroutes.
While the state still legally owns France's motorways today, it is now private, for-profit companies that are responsible for the funding, building, maintenance and management of over 9,000 kilometers of roads. This is how they divide up the territory. Controlling the northern highways is Spanish firm Abertis, a subsidiary of Italian fashion brand Benetton, which also oversees 60% of Spain's high-speed road network. Maintaining over 2,000 kilometers of motorway, mainly across the country's eastern region, is Eiffage. Eiffage is one of France's biggest construction and concession companies and is most famous for building the Millau Viaduct, the tallest bridge in the world. The rest of the network, and the largest share, is handled by Vinci, which runs over 4,000 kilometers of toll roads in France. In the first half of 2024, the company, which also operates Los Angeles' 91 express lanes, recorded revenues of over 33 billion euros, of which 3 billion euros came from the French motorway concessions. In 2006, the state and the concession companies agreed a price of 14.8 billion euros for the full privatization of the highways. However, in 2019, the French General Accounting Office found that the right price should have been closer to 24 billion euros. A 9 billion euros shortfall.
Ce qui a fait polémique, c'est d'essayer de déterminer le prix justement de la privatisation de la gestion des autoroutes. Ce prix a été contesté, mais il était compliqué quand même pour l'État d'évaluer son propre patrimoine. Et avec le recul, on peut se demander effectivement si ce n'est pas une erreur, puisque les milliards qui ont été gagnés dans le cadre de cette attribution sont une goutte d'eau par rapport à la dette de l'époque.
We contacted the French private concession companies for this video, but got no reply or a refusal to respond. However, this is what Pierre Coppet, Vinci's former CEO, said during a 2023 Senate hearing on the future of motorway concessions.
Parce qu'on parle régulièrement, lorsqu'on parle de la cession des autoroutes, des fameux 14 milliards. Mais il ne faut pas oublier qu'il y avait attaché aux sociétés concessionnaires une dette qui était de l'ordre de 20 milliards et qu'il y avait des investissements différés, c'est-à-dire des obligations d'investir dans les contrats. J'ai recalculé que depuis 2005, l'ensemble des sociétés concessionnaires ont investi 30 milliards d'euros sur les réseaux avec des extensions, avec des élargissements ou des ouvrages d'adaptation.
For Vinci and other concession companies, these big numbers weren't surprising, as a large level of investment is necessary in the financial model of a motorway concession. Copé explained this in 2020 during a hearing of the Parliamentary Inquiry Committee on Concession Companies.
On commence par par lever du capital, faire des dettes et faire des investissements. Puis on démarre, une fois qu'on a mis en service la concession, son exploitation, et petit à petit on commence à gagner de l'argent. Ça correspond à gagner de l'argent pour permettre de rembourser les investissements.
To ensure revenue for these companies, toll prices are included in concession contracts and controlled, with a provision that prices can rise up to 70% of inflation every year. According to the Association of French Motorway Companies, for 10 euros spent at the toll gate, 6,30 euros are allocated to management operations, modernization investments, and the repayment of debt and investors. The rest is paid to the state through tax and duties.
That level of toll will typically be calculated by considering the level of investment that is expected of the concession holder in order primarily to build the motorway, and then on an ongoing basis to maintain the motorway in a fit state.
This is Catherine Galano. She's a director at Frontier Economics, a consultancy which has advised the French transport regulator on monitoring concessions' profitability.
It also takes into consideration ongoing spend that may be required to operate the motorway every year. The toll is set so that given the expected number of users of the motorway, those costs will be reimbursed to the operator and they will be able to earn a return. So indeed, in France, it is largely users paying for the use of motorways.
Consumers and companies have struggled to understand the annual price rise impacting their businesses and wallets, especially now that highways have been entirely built.
Traveling on the highway in France is comfortable because it's straight and it's quick, but it costs us a fortune.
This is Nathalie Justice. She's a mother of two living in Bordeaux and travels regularly to London, where her husband is based.
Each trip that we take costs us about £300 in ferries, but then you have to add 180 euros of French tolls and I guess 100 euros worth of petrol. We're doing it 4 or 5 times a year. Every time we travel, it must add up to 600 or 650 pounds. We moved to France in 2016 when our youngest was born, and my husband was working every other week in France. So he spent a week in London and then he did remote working in France every other week, and that worked well. 2 years ago, my husband's work situation changed and he had to be in London for at least 3 years. The girls and I are commuting every school holiday to see my husband and their dad. We could fly, that's definitely much cheaper, but then you don't have the flexibility of move around here, go to play dates or go visit the in-laws, because once you're in London, traveling by public transport is super expensive.
Toll prices have been a contested issue for years. Even though concession companies would argue that highways are a high-risk business, in 2014, the Accounting Office, alongside the French Senate and the Competition Authority, disagreed, pointing to the fact that these companies were originally backed by the state and said they had essentially created an exceptional rent, a guaranteed income for little cost. While the average yearly profit margin for a utility company is about 9%, the Competition Authority found that the annual profit margin for these companies rose over the years, with some like Sanef SAPN doubling their profits, reaching highs comparable to some tech companies like Apple's 25% profit margin. It also concluded that exceptional dividends were distributed to shareholders, financed by debt. Between 2003 and 2005, highway concession companies redistributed 56% of their profits on average. This rose to 136% on average over the next 8 years. The French Senate expects dividends to reach 40 billion euros between 2022 and 2036, the date when all contracts are meant to end.
On oublie toujours que, en réalité, une concession, c'est un véhicule d'investissement. C'est un véhicule d'investissement dont l'objet est de construire un ouvrage et dont le contrat permet de rembourser sa construction pour qu'au terme du contrat, on ait remboursé l'ensemble des dettes des obligataires et du capital et qu'on laisse à l'État l'ouvrage puisque l'État en est propriétaire. À la fin de la concession, le concessionnaire n'a plus rien, et s'il y a des dividendes aussi élevés sur les sociétés concessionnaires, c'est qu'elles doivent rembourser leur capital sur la durée du contrat.
But how do you measure the profitability of an infrastructure with such long-term investments?
The main economic concept that we use in order to assess the profitability of that operation is called the internal rate of return. And the internal rate of return is, in financial terms, basically the level of return on investment that equates all of the costs with all of the revenue from the point of view of the investor.
In 2022, according to the Transport Authority, the internal rate of return for the historic concession companies was on average 8%.
However, in practice, concession contracts have had several lives and in some cases date back from quite a while back, and therefore the practical calculation of a rate of return on an operation that may have started in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s has some limitations in terms of mere availability of the information. So that's a key difficulty. Another one is how you take into consideration what happens at the end of the concession. Do you assume that the investor has to be fully remunerated over the concession, or do you consider that maybe they will be left with something at the end that they can resell? And finally, another difficulty is with tax, because obviously in theory you need to take into consideration tax on the profitability of the investment. However, it's rarely the case that tax is paid by one motorway. You know, a motorway will be integrated within a corporate structure, and therefore you also have to fiddle with that.
But for Copay, profitability can't be measured year on year, and total profits can only be measured at the end of the contract, taking into account the total investments and costs.
Je ne sais pas vous dire, et personne ne peut vous dire, quel est le TRI à date. Le TRI à date est un non-sens. Vous avez un TRI théorique à la signature du contrat, vous constatez un TRI à la sortie, vous pouvez dire comment ont évolué les choses, mais le calcul du TRI à date n'a aucun sens.
In addition, this internal rate of return needs to be compared to the weighted cost of capital, which consists of the company's total equity and debt. While the cost of capital is equally difficult to measure precisely, the Transport Authority estimated it at 7% as of 2022 for historic companies, just below the internal rate of return. The authority concluded that if all variants stay the same until the end of the contracts, revenues will exceed costs. Although the percentage increase is small, 1 percentage point of internal rate of return is equivalent to an additional profit of 8% per year over the period from 2003 to 2036, which translates to an average of 740 million euros in extra revenue annually. Updated for 2022, this amounts to an additional 40 billion euros. Hence, several calls for a reduction of the contract durations.
Ce que l'on reproche le plus à ce système des concessions d'autoroutes, c'est que la durée de ces contrats a été beaucoup trop longue.
Concession contracts have lasted for up to 70 years, as additional clauses are added and renewed. But their initial duration, which is usually about 35 years, is fixed in contracts, as well as any authorized toll price rises. And any attempts to meddle with those contract terms can backfire. Let's go back to our chart looking at toll increases. Despite fairly consistent price rises over the years, in 2015, those increases came to a halt. That's because that year, the government decided to freeze toll prices. Unhappy with this decision, concession companies threatened to sue the state. Secret conversations followed, in which concession companies negotiated an extension of the contract's duration in exchange for a 3.2 billion euros investment over 10 years. They were also allowed to raise toll prices above their usual levels between 2019 and 2023.
À l'instar de la privatisation qui s'est réalisée à travers un décret, il y a nettement manqué de transparence, ce protocole de 2015 et un manque de lisibilité sur les liens entre les décideurs et le monde économique.
Since then, an authority has been created to oversee the regulation of highway companies and their relationship with state actors. But concession contracts signed over the years are now coming to an end. 90% of highway concessions are expiring between 2031 and 2036, meaning provisions need to be made now for what happens next. So what could be the alternative?
La nationalisation des autoroutes.
La nationalisation des sociétés concessionnaires d'autoroutes.
Je souhaite qu'on nationalise.
Moi, je ne crois absolument pas à cette nationalisation des autoroutes, parce qu'il ne faut pas oublier là encore que Nous sommes dans une situation de crise budgétaire très importante en France. Ce n'est pas parce que c'est l'État qui va gérer les autoroutes qu'il y aura forcément également une baisse tarifaire. Je pense notamment au tunnel du Mont-Blanc.
The Mont Blanc Tunnel is one of the few highways run by the state. It costs a driver about €55 to use it.
Il y a une forme d'hypocrisie à dire qu'il va y avoir une nationalisation des autoroutes, puisque déjà l'État devrait faire son travail en ce qui concerne les routes nationales.
Look at Switzerland. You just have to buy one little vignette that you use for the year and it costs €50, I think, nowadays. It's much easier. I don't think the roads are any different to France, where you pay a fortune and you don't drive on gold.
Pourquoi pas également envisager une forme de décentralisation, ou voire même une multitude de systèmes de gestion des autoroutes sur le territoire, avec parfois des opérateurs privés, parfois des opérateurs publics, pour favoriser cet enjeu majeur qu'est la décarbonation.
For now, the consumer has two choices: go cheaper and slower on ordinary national roads, or pay up